Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So I'm delighted to welcome to this edition of the Fatigue Files podcast the glorious Dr Maya Shetreat, who is just extraordinary. She combines a deep training in Western medicine. She's an MD, and she has incredible wisdom around plant medicine and Indigenous knowings, embodiment, spiritual practice. She is the real deal, and I'm really delighted, Maya, to welcome you today.
Well, I am honored to be here.
It's absolutely gorgeous to have you. And I was really hoping we could pick up on the kind of whole plant theme. There have been a couple of episodes of the Fatigue Files podcast. One was on forest bathing and the intelligence of trees. And one was with a scholar who's actually a post-humanist feminist, but she was talking about the companionship of plants when she was going through a particularly deep period in her life. And we didn't get into anything medicinal about plants, but I know that you are a great practitioner of the healing intelligence of plants as medicinal teachers. And I would love you to wax lyrical on that for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, because I'm an MD and also because I'm an herbalist, I can talk about the compounds and the receptors and the way that our physiology and the plant physiology kind of entrains, we could maybe say. And I also would say that in all of my years of working with plants and my evolution, I don't think I was ever really a very traditional thinking MD because I'm not a very traditional thinking person, right? I don't think in very conventional ways, it turns out. I mean, you never know that until you embed yourself in conventional systems and then you realize, yeah, I don't belong here. But I have evolved, and over the decades of evolution, I would definitely say that the companionship and the spiritual connection that we have with plants, and I don't even know if spiritual connection is the right word, or at least comprehensive enough. I would say that there are as yet invisible connections that we are starting to really understand better and better when we talk about things like the biofield and the science of the biofield. We do understand that there are these electromagnetic forces that are more than electromagnetic forces that combine with ours and influence us. So, all of this to say that I'll start a little more mainstream and just say that we've evolved with plants since humans existed. Plants are older than we are, evolutionarily speaking, for those who lean that way. Plants have been around for a very long time, as have fungi, right? And we humans are actually pretty late to the game. We're in our infancy in comparison. And plants have a tremendous number of ways that they support us. And some of them we know. I mean, literally, we breathe with plants, right? We can't breathe without plants, and plants rely on our exhale in a sense for their inhale. I mean, we're, if we kind of want to be poetic about it, but our relationship with plants is that fundamental. It's that right? And so when I talk about medicinal, I would say like it's so much deeper. It's a relationship of our life force, right? And just what allows us to exist. So that is just so fundamental and foundational. And then, you know, beyond that, we're in communication with plants in all sorts of ways, including ingesting them. And that starts with food, right? A lot of our food is from plants, and a lot of our food lives on plants, right? If we eat animals generally live on plants. So, and we eat not just what we eat, but what we eat eats, right? So there's that whole component. And then for me, the primary medicine that I practiced in my adult and pediatric neurology practice that I did for well over a decade was really based in herbal medicine. For me, I always felt the lowest risk, highest yield treatment was what any person who was suffering or needing support deserved first and foremost. And it would usually be something I was willing to put in my own body and experience, or in my children's bodies, so that I knew something about how they worked, not just to experiment on myself or my children, but because I felt that that was what was needed. And then I could say, oh, well, this could happen, that could happen. And you know, what I found to my surprise in my practice is that herbal medicine, in the ways that people think of it, right? Taking it as a tincture, as a tea, as a pill, you know, and as a poultice, right? Any number of things, was profoundly effective in addressing the vast majority of what I needed to address in my practice, which were not small things, because, you know, I wasn't seeing just people who scraped their knee. You know, I was seeing actually people who had gone to many, many doctors, oftentimes coming from all over the world, because I was, you know, doing adult neurology, but I focused for a long time in pediatric neurology, and there were just not very many pediatric neurologists who were outside the box. And, you know, so I treated mystery diseases, degenerative diseases, epilepsy, autism. I mean, the whole gamut of profound conditions. And I'm not saying plants cured every person, but neither does anything else that we have available. And of course, I use pharmaceuticals where, you know, appropriate, in the trajectory of treatment, if that was appropriate. But did it help most people? And did it get most people to where they were able to instigate their own healing process? Because I think that's one of the things that is the most important about us partnering with plants. And that's how I think of it, right? I wouldn't say like, did you use this or did you use that? Because I don't see plants as like, you know, a tool or like a resource, right? I think of them as partners, as allies. So, you know, working with a plant, the whole idea of healing, I mean, you could break a bone, right? Nobody else can fix that bone but you. I mean, you could get it set. There's things that can happen, right, that are from the outside, but ultimately what we are always doing is trying to instigate our own internal healing processes. And we've evolved with plants. Plants know how to help our bodies do that, right? We could get very technical about that, but because the science is there more and more and more.
It's absolutely beautiful, Maya, because what I'm hearing there is this gorgeous picture being created of fundamentally convergent, creaturely, earthling intelligences in the body, in the plants. It's a fundamentally relational, and the gorgeous kind of sense of the ancient nature of this partnership is just resonant in everything that you're saying. Now, I know that one thing that you sometimes have spoken about, or I've seen your kind of blurbs and things, is about plant teachers. And I would love you to open up the whole way that you kind of feel into plants as teachers, as older intelligences, and obviously the body is older than Homo sapiens, right? We kind of mitochondrially, we're, for example, much more ancient than the neocortex. So I feel that there's a sort of threading or weaving that goes way back before our neocortical arrival, where the body instinctively recognizes this co-evolved companionship that you're speaking of. There's, in a sense, in what you're saying, that we're kin with plants. There's a kinship, right? So I'd love you to open that out a bit more, and also this idea of plants as teachers, and how would you welcome people who are struggling with their health to approach plants as healers? Where could they start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I wrote a book which came out in 2023 called The Master Plant Experience. And while the focus of that book is more on psychedelic master plants or plant teachers, what I'll say about master plants, and master plants, by the way, is an Indigenous term, and I don't speak for Indigenous people, who are a very massive and varied group with, many different points of view. But this is a term that I learned from my Indigenous teachers. And so the way I'll define master plants or teacher plants is that they are powerful plants that are considered beings. So that's important. And kin, right? They're often called grandmother, grandfather, mother, father, and they transmit ancient wisdom that is necessary for shifting human consciousness and helping us navigate the human experience. So, while not all master plants are psychedelic, so for example, coffee, the coffee plant is a master plant. The cacao plant is a master plant. And we can think, right, of what people will do. The tobacco plant is a master plant, right? Plants that will make people go quite a bit out of their way to interact with that plant and experience the kind of shift that comes with that plant, which very often, when engaged with in a respectful and reverent way, will be transformative in a very positive way. In other words, the way we interact with tobacco as a civilization in modern society is not very reverent, one could argue. And so I'm going to tell you a story, actually, about when I wrote my book, and I included, when I discussed various master plants, I looked at lore, because I believe that story is a very important part of extra literate knowing, which is actually what most knowing has been since the beginning of time. And it's a really important kind of knowing to respect. And I go into that quite a bit because it's actually very interesting. But the lore about tobacco, which is the most sacred plant in the world, even in places where the medicine people or, the shamans, where it's not indigenous to that area. And the lore is that the spirit of tobacco created humans to honor tobacco. So I say that because these masters, right, we have maybe a very wrong-headed idea about what they're here for and what we're here for, if we start to think about plants as allies and teachers, it's not, how can I, make it through the day? I mean, it's not how can I make it through the day? It is partly that, but it's also, what am I really here to do? Is it to, be running around and being on social media all day and right, like whatever the things are, I'm not even good at coming up with, but all the things that kind of suck us in, or is it something else altogether? So there are a lot of master plants that are really considered there to guide us. Now, when it comes to psychedelics, which we can talk about if you'd like, all psychedelics are considered masters. And by the way, master plants that's not a botanical term. So it's flora, fauna, fungi, right? It's not like, oh, well, there's master mushrooms versus master plant, right? Master plants kind of is that umbrella term. But I think it's a real reversal too, to just think about plants as teaching us and guiding us. And I think there's some real surrender in that kind of paradigm that we I don't know whether I can call it modern society or Western civilization or the global North, or how do we want to see it? And I'm not trying to idealize any one particular group or kind of civilization, but I will say we really think we have to be in control a lot in our society that most of the people probably listening are living in. And it's oppressive because that is not the kind of understanding that people have had for the vast majority of human existence.
Absolutely. And this reminds me, have you come across the term plantationocene? It's you'll have come across the term Anthropocene, right? Which is this term that geologists have coined to talk about a human-made climate era. And of course, it overplays the human in two ways. One, it makes the human really central, as if the planet was smooth before the arrival of industrial capitalist society. And of course, it was always bumpy and lively and had its own energies, right? And its own times of crisis and all the rest of it, which is not to deny the negative impacts of anthropogenic climate change, but it's to say the human agent is not the only determinant here. And the other way it's totalizing is, of course, that the anthropos produced by that is largely assumed to be, at a mythic level, precisely the controlling agent you've just got at, the rationalistic, colonizing, white, Eurocentric construct of the human. So it's problematic in all sorts of ways. And I think it was Anna Singh, I'm not sure, who came up with the term plantationocene. And she's making the point that plants are lively. They have a genetic force in the planet, which sounds like an obvious statement at a certain level, but she makes the point that the Industrial Revolution was based on the colonization of plants and the model of the slave practices on the plantations, right? So there's something here about the way in which plants have been corralled by and reduced by precisely these anthropogenic industrializing processes, which in turn weaken human well-being, because actually we know that monocropping, for example, is extremely negative and weakens the potency of plants we ingest. We know that a certain degree of eco-wildness and the kind of entangled relations that plants naturally show us in relatively unspoilt habitats, if there are such things anymore, demonstrate in a way metaphorical and literal structures of how it is to generate health out of kind of diversity. And there's just this wonderful resonance there with the way that, for example, the gut needs diverse bioflora. And I'm just really struck by the way in which this idea of the master teacher plants, the teacher plants, calls us back to this initial sense of reverence and kinship that those industrializing forces, which is interesting that you went there, stripped away. And in a way, tobacco is the paradigmatic example precisely of all that you're saying. Because if tobacco's the ultimate master plant across varied cultures, it's difficult to think of a symbol of health-destroying reductionism that's more potent than tobacco, particularly when we think about, and I'm getting a bit excited here, the notion of respiration, right? Breathing, and where you started with this kinship of breath, or what David Abrams once, recently heard a talk of his called The Commonwealth of Breath, where he's actually talking about the atmosphere as part of the planetary environment. It's the very breath of spirit itself. So that where he went in the end blew my mind, because he goes to the Jewish name for God, which is often pronounced Yahweh, but it's actually just YWHW, which sounds like because there's no vowel in it, so it sounds like breath. So folding this all together, Maya, there's this beautiful thing about respiratory kinship, diversity, and the way that we treat tobacco and have reduced our breath to this really sick-making, monocultural, toxic intake that comes precisely from that colonizing dynamic that lies at the heart of the Plantationocene. So there's something really deep here. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with it, but I'm very excited.
Well, and I think we could add sort of another level to this, or layer to this, which is just this cognitivism, right, that we have as humans that kind of assumes that we're at the top of some pyramid, right, of superiority because we have a big brain. And so, to go back to the ancient parts of us that are our cells, and really even our mitochondria and the organelles of our cells. So part of what I teach, and in fact what I write about as well in the master plant experience, is that we are really like a universe, right? We're a collection of beings. We're an emergent system of beings, right? And we could think about it in the form of mitochondria, in the form of cells, in the form of systems, in the form, right? I mean, and it gets to be, community by community, like these, nesting dolls. But they've chosen in some way to come together, to coalesce and have a common purpose of some sort, which is, Anna or Maya or, and beyond. And so I actually am a very unusual neurologist in the fact that I have respect for the brain, of course, and the nervous system, but I actually believe that cells are intelligent, that microbes are intelligent, and I can make a whole case for it. And in fact, I do in, talks I give to thousands of doctors. I can talk about the way mitochondria actually make decisions. They are decision making. They communicate with microbes very directly through an ancient form of communication called quorum sensing, and they use the superhighways of the extracellular space of the body as these electrical conduction systems of communication. So, from that whole standpoint, we're actually much richer and also not as centrally ruled, you might say, as most people who are cognitivists would have us believe. And on the other side of it, if you look at plants, you actually could make a very strong argument, which I do in my chapter called Plants Are Beings, that plants actually really do possess a brain, even though it's not in the form of an organ. It's a form of neural network, which is their root system. And the first person who wrote about this that I know of, a scientist some people may have heard of, and his name is Charles Darwin, who wrote about it in his 1880 book, The Power of Movement of Plants. But if you think of plants as being upside down, okay, if we need to think of them in kind of that humanizing form, and their legs and kind of genitalia, which is their flowers, are visible to us, right? And their brains, in their root systems, they store memories, they analyze inputs, they design responses, they plan for the future. It actually resembles our neural network. And in talks that I give, I show pictures, our neural network and root networks, and how almost indistinguishable they can be. They produce serotonin and dopamine and melatonin and acetylcholine and GABA, all neurotransmitters. They're dynamic. They're sensitive to the world around them. They make tools, largely chemical. So plants are actually much more, if we were going to say intelligence is what makes us human, we could argue, or having a big brain, we could argue, in fact, that plants have much larger neural networks than we have. They communicate across species. They communicate with other plants, and not just their own species of plants, but, they go through many different kinds of plants, and in fact communicate with animals and draw certain animals and insects depending on what's needed in a particular situation. If there's a predator, they'll draw the predator of their predator, and so on and so forth. So, just to kind of layer that into the conversation about plants and breath and the plantation scene, right? All of these things, and tobacco, is we probably could spend a little time being a little more curious about our kin that are, as Abrams, I think, has said, greater than human kin, right? So there's probably a lot we can learn. There is a lot we can learn, and there's also language. And, I go really deeply into the language of plants, and many people have. And it's really profound and poetic and remarkable and scientific and sacred and ancient, all at the same time.
I love it. I love it. And what I especially love about it is this distributed, agentic relationality that characterizes the planetary flows and tensions and dynamics of Earth and Earth creatures and Earth beings. And this idea of the body as this vast sea of cellular communication, trillions and trillions of highly intelligent, as you say, decision making, cellular structures with intransigence of their own. Donna Haraway talks about matter's independent sense of humor, which I think is a lovely way of thinking about it. But that's so important, I think, for people when they've got complex conditions, because it seems to me that there's a lot of cognitivism in approaches to healing, and that plant intelligence and understanding these network modes of being and becoming, of emerging, co-emerging in these lively dynamics of communication, invites a very non-cognitivist opening to the complexity of embodiment itself. And you use the term emergent system. As a new materialist, I think in terms of system, yes, but assemblage, because system almost sounds a bit too organized, but an assemblage has that kind of playful, almost adventurous or curious dimension to it, where things stumbled across and then adapted and adopted over time. And there's something here for people suffering from complex conditions that invites them, I think, into a radical trust of their own body system, their own body assemblage, as much, much older, much, much more intelligent than they are in their 40 bits of information a second cognitive function. And honestly, I get a little tired of the mind over matter implications of certain recovery approaches, because actually what it leaves out of the equation entirely, to my humble way of thinking, and, you know, like you, I'm fascinated by the brain and nervous system. How can we not be? It's amazing. But actually, body as guru, you know, body as guru to me is a path. And for me, listening to you, Maya, that body guru has evolved over millennia in partnership with these other teachers, these other wisdoms. And it's that return, isn't it, to humility and curiosity, as you said, to get curious about plants and to get curious about ourselves. Right?
Absolutely. I think, you know, so that is a big part of where I try to take people, is into that sense of curiosity, not just about plants, but about everything. And playfulness, and right, the idea of things being low stakes, so that we can feel that sense of inquiry, right? What if, you know, or, ooh, how interesting, rather than making, you know, kind of taking things as being set in stone. And so, you know, I think this is a good moment maybe to talk about cellular memory, because it's so relevant to people who are, well, to everyone really, and particularly to people who are struggling with chronic or long-term illness. But you know, what I would say, and this kind of dovetails with everything we've talked about in terms of the cell and in terms of these messy, you know, gatherings, right, that they have together, or assemblages, is cells are actually, so we've said they're intelligent. They actually are very fluent in many languages: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, ancestral, communal, ecological, right? So the cell, our cells, they understand all of those languages. So we can be humiliated, right? Nothing happened to us physically. It wasn't a physical insult, but it could be a sense of unsafety, or a sense of, you know, shame, right? Any number of those kinds of things that could be non-physical and could still be translated by the cell, who understands that language, changes its configuration, literally. So mitochondria that are safe and happy, okay, to just really simplify, are like branch spaghetti that are touching one another and exchanging information and working together in a network. And when they are in defense or protection mode, they ball up like meatballs. They don't touch one another. So you can always think of it, and I say it like this so people will never forget, when you are in cell danger, you are in protection mode, you're in defense mode, you have the meatball mitochondria, versus when you are in growth mode, curiosity mode, play mode, you are in the branch spaghetti, the spaghetti mode, right? Your mitochondria are exchanging all of the information and releasing waste and doing everything that they need to be doing. And that kind of could be translated then to the cell, which also has different configuration, as well, and so on and so forth. And so where am I going with this? We can get very rigid because of cellular memory. sometimes these memories really, they get stuck in us. And this is kind of that conversation about trauma, which I think of trauma as wounding, and I think we all have our woundings. So I don't think trauma is normal, but it is common, and it's certainly part of the human experience, or at least it seems to be. If we look at the list of adverse childhood events, I would say like many, many, many people experience some form or many forms of these, adverse childhood events, divorce, like addiction in the family, someone maybe being incarcerated, abuse, physical, mental, sexual. I mean, these are things, unfortunately, that many of us experience some combination of those, some more than others. And we know that those are correlated with poor mitochondrial function, like literally less mitochondrial energy, and that has been measured. We also know it's correlated with illness. It's correlated with illness, especially that starts at a younger age, but can happen at any age. And when I say younger age, I mean young adult. So adulthood illness, and I'm even talking schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, as well as autoimmunity and cancer. And I mean, you name it, has at least been triggered by, if not caused by, our woundings and this cellular memory that is stuck, right? Because trauma is not what happens to us, but it's how it embeds in our cells, as I've just explained. So this kind of takes us to this situation where we then can live in a very rigid way, not intentionally. It doesn't actually have to do necessarily with I'm, only going to wear black shirts and, white pants every day or whatever. It's more, there's this concept of predictive coding. Okay. And this takes us into some of why psychedelics can be so profoundly healing to people with chronic illness or trauma in general, right? Whether or not they have chronic illness or a chronic condition. The predictive coding is basically when we walk into some new situation and we think we're seeing everything, all the details, right? I mean, I walk into the room, I'm like, okay, it's a party, there are people drinking, there's music, there's, whatever. People are dressed up. It turns out we actually don't really see that many details at all in a new situation. We see a few. And then we our brains fill in all of the rest of the information based on past experience. So that's a great survival skill, because if there's something dangerous, there's like, a tiger is going to pounce on you. You can't just sit and gather, 10 million details. You need to turn around and run. But if a tiger once was about to pounce on you, and now every time you go in, there's something that kind of maybe reminds you or prompts you to think there could be a tiger here, then you're always going to be operating like you're about to be pounced on by a tiger when you're not, right? And it doesn't have to be that dramatic, but it's certainly very unconscious. And the way that we can operate sort of, right? Fish don't know they're swimming in water.
Absolutely. And what I love about this as well, with the mitochondrial role in this, is, of course, it's very obvious, is it sort of common sense. If the mitochondria are in the meatball configuration, there's a breakdown of communication, right? Mm-hmm. The system is not flowing when the mitochondria go into that position. And so you're going to get information disruptions and the rest of it. And you get the whole system starting to lose its homeostatic dynamics. And this idea of frozen traumas carried at a cellular level, combining with the brain's generalized predictive capacity, also explains not just how psychedelics are brilliant at shifting the reality tunnel into something else and producing a new lived experience, right? Because the brain is now updating because it's having a new lived experience of a different kind of awareness. But it also explains why things like hypnosis, done well, are really powerful, because you're also giving the body a new kinesthetic experience that's felt. This is not cognitive work. It's non-cognitive work. It actually it's useful sometimes to have the neocortical function to name emotions and to bring in that kind of operative understanding can be useful, but it's limited, I think. I think actually the real place where healing becomes ultra powerful is in these non-cognitive other forms of communication, non-linguistic and sometimes linguistic, but metaphorical and literal physiological communication that can escape the limitations of the constructed reality tunnel that the brain carries. But also, from what you're saying, trauma living in the body at a cellular level, that presumably, Maya, explains why sometimes going in at the cellular level with a phytonutrient or a phytocannabinoid or some other compound works so powerfully, precisely because it's cell to cell communication across species.
Well, so that's interesting that you say that, because if we were talking to the Indigenous teachers who are, I think, the experts in all of this conversation, and I'll tell you why I think they are in a moment, they would say, this is the spirit of the plant talking to your spirit. And I want to say that because, and now I'll back it up a little bit here for the people who are not into that idea, that probably 70+% of conventional pharmaceuticals that are used in hospitals and medical centers and pharmacies today are derived from Indigenous knowledge. How did they get that Indigenous knowledge? Bioprospectors, an anthropologist went and spent time, anyone, let me jump ahead and say, anyone who has ever spent time in the jungle, in the rainforest, there are hundreds of thousands of plants, and they're not all that remarkable looking compared to other plants. It's very lush. It's not like you could sit without knowing a lot and be able to pick out this one, right? And Indigenous people know how to use a lot of those plants and how to use them in a very technical way. And I can use the example of ayahuasca, but there's many different examples actually related to even like anesthetics that are currently used today, where like ayahuasca is a beautiful vine, but it's not like, oh my gosh, like this looks so incredibly like a psychedelic, or, and ayahuasca itself is not a psychedelic plant. It's sort of famous as a psychedelic, but is not actually. Ayahuasca, it turns out, has to be mixed with another plant. So the ayahuasca vine has to be cut and cooked for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours until it is like a thick paste. And it still wouldn't really cause any psychedelic experience whatsoever unless it were mixed then with another plant that contained DMT, because the enzyme in the ayahuasca blocks our breaking down of DMT, which is a psychedelic molecule. P.S. We also make our own DMT endogenously in our own nervous system. Animals also make DMT. So it's an endogenous entheogen, it's called, like an endogenous psychedelic, but we break it down very quickly. And then many plants, also produce DMT or contain DMT. And when mixed with the ayahuasca plant in a very, very specific way, only then, okay, is it actually this sacred medicine that, has all of these very profound benefits that we've seen in kind of all of the psychedelic research, reversing all kinds of chronic conditions with just one dose, right? Or the same with the psilocybe mushrooms and other things. Why am I saying all of this? Because people tend to poo-poo, when the bioprospectors or the anthropologists would say, "How do you know these things about these plants?" they would say the plants told us.
Yeah.
And that, they were perfectly happy to take the knowledge back and then create synthetics and all these other things. And, PS, that intellectual property was never, there was no reciprocity there, right? No real taking care of the people who brought this knowledge. And at the same time, they could easily poo-poo, oh, like these people are crazy. They're just saying the plants told us. But I think why I bring this up is because there is a very profound, longstanding, and proof of Indigenous science that does incorporate the idea of plant knowing and plant communication on, they say the spirit of the plant, and you could call it a lot of things. I don't care. I don't care what people want to call it. But, if I talk to my teachers and say psychedelics or compounds or receptors, they, like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, not because they're stupid, but because they're like, you don't understand. You're trying to make something material that is not material. And
see, that's really interesting, because I would see it as multidimensional, that it works at all the layers, right?
of course.
And for me, spirit is a kind of materiality, but not a materiality that we understand the way we understand materiality, right? It's got affect, it's got force, it makes meaning, it's profound, it has resonant energies, it has presence. So I think I get where they're coming from if they're saying, look, don't be reductive about it. Don't reduce it to that.
Well, that's what they're saying, right? That is what they're saying, because nobody who talks about material things, Anna, is defining it the way you're defining it. For the most part.
The new materialists are, but the old scientific materialism doesn't. But the irony here is, of course, the more we look into materiality with things like, quantum physics, the more kind of spooky and magical and spirit like it becomes. So there's a real need, I think, in our culture to shift our view of matter itself, to understand it as this lively materializing agency. And there's a real need to shift our understanding of what it is to know, because what strikes me about the bioprospecting is you're coming in as an empiricist and you're saying, okay, this works, A causes B, I'll take that, but I'm not going to take the knowing, the source of knowledge. I'm going to reconstruct it as my knowing, my scientific knowing, from my rationalistic cognitivist framework. I'm not going to give credit to the non-cognitive, sensory, creaturely knowing and spiritual connection that these people feel with the plant. That's just more European arrogance, isn't it, really? And it's got a lot to do with why people are chronically ill in the first place, after all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will just call it arrogance. I don't even know if we need to make it any. I don't think Europeans have the have the only claim to being arrogant in the world.
I would agree with that. I just think that, as someone who's come from kind of a legal background, looking at the international legal system and the worldview it conveys has been very strongly influenced by Eurocentricity. Right?
Of course.
That's going to tilt my perspective. But I think we're sort of running out of time here. But I think the really wonderful thing about this conversation, Maya, quite apart from your encyclopedic, beautiful knowledge and engagement, is this wonderful invitation that I feel is being issued here to anyone who's chronically ill, to open up to the magic of the world around them, to open up to their kinship with the more than human the more than human dynamics in which they're apart, and the more than human dynamics in their own human body, the assemblage of ancient cellular intelligences that long pre-exist the human neocortex. There's something really rich here about coming home to ourselves as these much, much more embedded, much, much more entangled, much, much more emergent beings with access to all these non-cognitive ways of knowing and being.
Absolutely. I think there are times where as you said, our cognition serves us, and times when we would be better served by leaning into the knowing of ourselves, right? That ancient knowing, and of the knowings of the beings around us. And that conversation that we're in, which is really what we're made of. We're really made of conversation, and everything we know about the microbiome and the mitochondria and the gut brain and all of these different ideas are very much like we're awash in relationship, and that is what defines us. So I very much agree with you. And I actually will just say that I actually think that idea of quantum physics and quantum biology is really the future of medicine and of healing. It's very rigorous, but it's also very nuanced. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot there.
I do too. I do. And thank you very much. It's been so absolutely lovely to have you with me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Maya.